we have a number of people here, and it's great to have you all. Thanks for joining. Today I'm here with Juan Rossi, Senior Security Platform Manager. Is that right? At Mercado Libre, Juan?
Yeah, Senior Manager for the Platform Security team. That's correct.
Good, and we're going to be talking about authorization at Meli, but before we kind of like dive deep into a topic, can you share a bit about, again, the company, if anyone is not familiar with it, but then also kind of like what your role is there and kind of like what you've been up to so far?
Yeah, for sure. So Mercado Libre is the largest e-commerce company for here in Latin America, and it's also the largest payment processor um, as well. So there are two options if you want that you can use, but Mercado Pago as a business unit uh, is the largest one. And so I've been working here at the company for, I think, have 5.5 years or so. Um, I've been in this role for well, I've been working with the platform security team for about a year or so. Before that, I managed the SRE team for Mercado Pago, and currently I'm heading I'm managing the whole authentication, authorization, and delegation of permissions for APIs, being mechanisms that we implement for external clients that use our APIs or internal solutions such as the authorization, for example.
Okay, that sounds great. So you mentioned a couple of terms that are very like industry specific, and people that have worked with those are going to be familiar with them. Before we kind of like dive into those terms like authentication, authorization, and permissions, so that's kind of like what the team does. Like, what does platform security mean? Like, what does security mean in that particular context? But also, what does thinking of it as a platform team mean?
Yeah, sure. So what we do, well, obviously authentication is understanding who your user is, what's their identity, and the authorization part is checking if they have the correct permissions to do a specific action. So what we as a platform security team do is basically create and maintain several solutions that we provide for our whole company. So anyone that has to create a new API has the solutions available to manage the authentication, the authorization, and they don't have to create them from scratch. Um, the whole, I think right now we are more than 10,000 uh, employees on the IT side, maybe a bit less, but as a company,
Wow.
we have more than 20,000 people.
Wow,
So it's a,
10,000 is a lot.
yeah, it's huge. So, and a lot of people are joining the company each week. So it's obviously a really hard problem because you you can't have everyone learning from scratch and having to implement something so core as the authentication or authorization for the APIs. Each time they have to do something new. So we need to create solutions that are easy to use, that are able to implement in any type of language or technology, and there are available from a uh, as you have, for example, code reviews or testing or coverage or something that is really part of your application. The authentication and authorization need to be part as well. So we try to do that type of solutions as a part of uh, the basic process of creating a new application.
Okay, that makes sense of kind of like repeating this back to you again. The very large company, we mentioned like 10K people total in IT, lots of people joining each week. Authorization, authentication are critical parts of what you do. Of course, you care about your users, your customers, and their security. You want to make sure everything's working. So you give building blocks to different teams. You give them libraries, you give them services, you give them even guidance and consulting in some cases, so for them to kind of like be able to take those building blocks and implement these things in the right way.
Yeah, that's correct.
Okay, that's great. You mentioned like three things. You mentioned authentication. You explained a bit about what authentication is. You also mentioned authorization and delegation. Can you share a bit about what those two concepts are before we dive into specifically authorization, which is the kind of like the big topic for today?
You mean to explain authorization and delegation of permissions, or?
Yep.
Yeah. So the authorization part I mentioned that is when you have to validate or make sure that a specific user has the ability to do a specific action in your platform. For example, if someone is buying a specific item on our marketplace, on our e-commerce site, they obviously need to have permissions to do so. They need to be able to create a specific item if they want to sell a specific thing or product. And each time a user do actions on our platform, we need to validate those things. And there are some cases where you want someone, for example, an employee, to have specific permissions to your company or to your account to do things in your behalf. So in those cases, there's the delegation of permissions. There are several ways to do so. OAuth is one of the ways we currently use to handle the authorization between users. I know you talked a lot about OAuth on your last Twitter space. So I'll plug that for you, and everyone can then go to listen it. But and there are some other cases where you basically, as I mentioned, to make sure that your employees can do several things on your behalf, and there are other things that you don't want them to do, or information that you don't want them to be able to access. In those cases, authorization is super important to prevent data leaks and obviously unwanted actions by other users.
Yeah, that's a very good explanation, and I really like the examples, right? So when we talk about authorization, it's what you can do, and then when we talk about delegation, it's essentially giving someone else the ability to do something, typically kind of like on your behalf. And the fact that it's on your behalf is important because the fact that it happened on your behalf and not on their behalf needs to be traced across systems. Is something that you need for auditing purposes in general and all sorts of security features, right?
Yeah.
Good. So kind of like getting into authorization, one of the things that I think would be interesting, and maybe we can use the use case that you presented as an example, is like to start talking about like a use case concretely, and that's kind of like the journey that we can use to kind of like go through things. So like, is that a good use case where we say, hey, I want to see who is authorized to do something? Do we want to talk maybe about like a Mercado Pago use case? What's a typical or easy to explain use case from the platform? And I ask about this because I know you're really complex in terms of like infrastructure, lots of services, lots of things going on. So maybe kind of like having a simple way for people to kind of like reason, have a mental model of what we're going to talk about might be interesting.
Yeah, sure. So I think maybe creating a payment is something that's simple and complex at the same time. So you usually have two parts: a payer and a seller on a request, on a transaction, and And in those cases, you want to be able to understand if the seller has the ability, for example, to create a payment, and um, obviously there are sometimes that you also need to validate that the payer can uh, basically pay for those things, being that um, depends on the type of payment method that they're using. Um, it depends on basic permissions that you can validate, and obviously, a bunch of business rules that you can also check and maybe think as an authorization part of the transaction of the request.
Yes. Okay. So that's interesting. So there are kind of like, it seems, two parts to creating a payment. One that the seller does. Hey, the notion of a payment is created, and then the buyer goes and kind of like pays for that thing. So the entity is created by the seller, then the buyer goes pays for it. Let's focus maybe on one of those, the payment part of the payment. So like as a buyer, what I do, and you mentioned there are a couple of
Yeah.
things, the payment method, the conditions for that, and so on. What's a typical interaction that, like, how many things do you need to gather data from to kind of like make that decision? You mentioned kind of like the payment method, that seems to be one. Data about the user, like it seems that there are lots of things that are required to make an authorization decision.
Yeah, but if you think, I mean, you can go pretty deep when analyzing those things, but from the most basic part of the transaction, you first want to be able to understand if a specific buyer has the correct permissions to create a payment. Maybe you saw that a specific buyer has been trying to, I don't know, create fraudulent transactions for a while, and you want to cancel their account, so they won't have the specific permissions to create a payment in that case. So in those cases, we have specific identity management processes where we store the permissions of our users. So from the most basic part, you are able to understand or ask the question, does Schenkel has the permission to create a payment as a buyer in a transaction? And the answer should be yes or no. There are no grays in that case.
Good. That makes sense. And this kind of like peeling the onion, right? Like that you asked a question and you phrase it in a way that again shows that you're used to this topic. Can this person, in this case Schenkel, perform this action? In this case, pay for this payment, the entity. So like you have the subject, you have the object, and you have the action. Who asks that question at Mercado Libre? Is that a gateway? Is that the service itself? Where does that check for authorization happen?
In our case, is the application that is processing the request. So obviously, Mercado Libre as a company has a microservices architecture that is pretty large, and you have a bunch of different microservices that are interacting when you need to create a payment or do any type of action in our platform. So in those cases, the different applications are in a specific request path uh, has to validate the different permissions. So, for example, there are obviously the ones that are close to the edge that are the most important because they're your first barrier to prevent attacks and to make sure that you don't waste resources. So in those cases, we focus on them having the they have to implement our services to know which questions they need to ask. So in the specific cases, does the user X has permission to create a payment? And the answer should be yes or no. We have several ways for implementing that type of questions, and obviously it's a pretty difficult part of our job because we come from a specific way of doing authorization, which was in some cases based on different libraries that they were on the code base of the applications, and we are trying to move away from that to a more centralized way to manage the policies and a way of asking the questions.
Okay, that makes sense. I'm going to kind of like try to summarize and then kind of like focus into some of these because it's kind of like the meat of what the security platform team does in terms of providing something for our teams. So I'm going to kind of like imagine a distant past where different services written in different programming languages, most of them, I guess, Java, were running authorization logic themselves. Traffic got into them, like again, maybe HTTP, HTTPS, but when it got to them, they made the decision within the process of what should have happened in terms of like an authorization decision. Can this user perform this payment? And the company has seen the value of doing a couple of things. First of all, the sooner you do that in terms of like closer to the edge, the better, because you prevent, as you said, resource waste. But at the same time, again, it's beneficial for a number of other reasons, making sure that you're not running code that you shouldn't be running, security, and so on. But at the same time, it seems like there is this notion, and kind of like you hinted at it, where like if you extract authorization logic away from application code and you put it kind of like somewhere else, it has other benefits. Can you talk about kind of like how you reasoned about this? Let's move this out of the code and put it somewhere else.
Yeah, so Mercado Libre right now has, I think, more than 8,000 or 10,000 applications. So obviously that's a huge distributed system, and that's for Mercado Libre, Mercado Pago, and the other different business units that the company has. So when you go from a system that is based on the code base on your application, you basically are opening for several types of possible issues. One being that if you don't have a really good system to maintain and make sure that all your libraries are updated in a short time, you may end up with applications that are not updating your libraries, and that could lead to possible vulnerabilities, or maybe is related to you need to push something to improve your service, or to have someone be able to test a new feature. And if you depend on how the applications and the teams are implementing your solution, that's pretty hard on this type of scale, right? And also when you think about making sure that you have visibility of an understanding of everything that's happening, I think implementing a centralized solution. And when I mean centralized is not that we have a specific API that handles everything. It's just that most of the ways that the authorization is implemented is the same for everyone, and we have a control of what happens there, and we try to
it's like an internal company standard.
Yeah, exactly. And we try to make sure that if we need to change anything, we don't depend on on the whole company to update their code base. Basically, we are able to do so on systems that we control, on ways that we control, and in the cases where we need to implement a specific library, the library is as simple as possible, and in most ways, the libraries ask the question for permissions to different type of services, and they're as complex as that. The whole complexity is taken to being sidecars or being other type of solutions or applications.
Makes sense. So you start thinking about authorization as a cross-cutting concern, and both as an aspect, if you think about like aspect-oriented programming, but also when you think about, again, microservices, you can essentially take some of those things and say, hey, I can have a sidecar, and then because this is just a service running next to another service, all of the typical things that you see at companies that like have a DevOps type culture, that do continuous deployment, all of those kind of like, you cross the cross-cutting concerns of authentication, authorization, etc., with the services, and then you can have an internal team that can kind of like handle the development lifecycle and operational lifecycle of security-related components.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And as you mentioned, is making sure that everything is standardized and that type of core solutions that need to affect or need to be used by the whole company.
That makes sense. And so you mentioned a couple of interesting things. You mentioned like the notion of running some logic at the edge, and then you also mentioned a sidecar. Can you share a bit, again, and I know this is where like it might get into kind of like details, some of them shareable, some of them not, so like again, as much as you can. What things does the platform team offer to other product teams at Mercado Libre, both to say, hey, this is a check that should be run at the edge, and how that kind of like logic is replicated across your fabric, your platform. And also the same thing, but what does the sidecar do? What can teams do with that sidecar?
Yeah, sure. So obviously these sort of solutions are not, we are not able to turn them on from day one because we depend on moving the whole company to this type of new solutions, as I mentioned. But where we are going right now and the things that we are sending to production are basically based on first authenticating our users on the edge of when we receive the request. The first thing we need to do is to authenticate our user. We need to understand if obviously the credentials that are being sent are correct, if the user credentials are not expired and whatnot, and we need to understand who our user is. And when we talk about identity, we basically need to understand not only what's their user ID and what country the user is from, but we also need to get the context of our user. What actions can they do? What are their permissions on our platform? And with all that information, we are creating a token. We call it the identity token, which is then sent to the applications. Okay, so with that information, with that concept that is being propagated on each of the hubs that our requests are done between microservices, the applications are able to ask the correct questions, basically in a low latency way. So sometimes you have obviously different ways of approaching this. In some cases, you might want or you might need to ask the question to a different microservice. So you need to your application need to do a request to the authorization application, what we call the PolicyAgent, which is the application that evaluates the permissions, and you might get an allow or a deny as a response. But as I mentioned, obviously, that has several costs. For example, you might be creating a single point of failure for your authorization, and you might be adding a lot of latency for your requests because you obviously need to go to another application. So what we are doing right now, and I'm deploying in some cases internally, is a sidecar, which is basically a Docker container application. Most of our microservices our instances have several containers that do several things. One of them is obviously the user, the developer application that they have been developing, and another one is the authorization sidecar, which is basically the same code base as the PolicyAgent I mentioned before. So in that case, if the application has the ability to ask the authorization question, so do this user has the require permissions to do this action? And obviously the answer should be yes or no. And if they are able to ask that question locally, that's obviously much faster, correct? And also
why is let me chime in there so that again because there are a number of interesting things here. Why is why is performance latency important for you for this particular operation, right? I guess you don't performance optimize everything, at least not initially.
Yeah, sure. So the authorization obviously is something is that these type of questions are being asked all the time. So anytime you need to do a specific action in Mercado Libre, Mercado Pago, you should be asking internally this type of question. The same is with authentication. You need to be able to understand that if I send a request to your application, I need to validate that the credentials for that specific request are correct, and maybe between one request and another, your credentials has expired. So you shouldn't be able to send requests after that, or those requests at least should be rejected. The same is with authorization. The permissions of a user can change anytime. So you need to be sure that every time you ask the question, you get an answer to understand if that specific user has the correct permissions to run a specific or to create a specific action. Okay, so those are questions that with our traffic, which is in the hundreds of millions of requests per minute, obviously could really impact the performance and how our users basically the speed of the requests that they are sending. Okay, and we want to make sure that sort of questions don't impact our users or don't generate other type of issues that could be happening if you have a lot of users that are maybe queuing to getting an answer. Okay, so performance and low latency is always a must in this type of solutions, I think.
So there's a reliability aspect to this, making sure that the system continues to function, queuing theory, things don't back up.
Yeah.
And then there's also the time is money aspect, which is, again, the longer something takes, the less people are likely to continue using the system. And also, of course, reliability also is money. So at the end of the day, everything is money. But
Yeah.
despite capitalism, we understand from a systems perspective. You mentioned a couple of other things, and maybe it would be good to kind of like go a bit into deeper detail. So kind of like for everyone listening, the approach that Meli uses is very similar to what's published also in a Netflix talk from QCon. It's called, let me see, user, device, and identity for microservices. Like Netflix calls it passport.
Yeah.
Meli calls it identity token. But it's like, again, if anyone's interested in like the details of that, you can go check that out. What's the format of this token? Kind of like quickly. What do you put in there, and what's the serialization, etc.?
Yeah, sure. So it's a JWT token, and basically the information that also is a signed token, and the information that it's on the token is mainly the information of what's the ID of the user, from which country the user is doing the request, or which country the user operates, and information regarding the type of credentials that they use. So in Meli you have different type of like web sessions, maybe mobile sessions, maybe an access token. There are several ways to authenticating, and not all those ways work in every application. So we need to have also the context on where those users are doing those requests.
Okay, that makes sense.
And then obviously the permissions, the main roles the user has, and obviously that is going to help to ask the questions about if a user has the ability to do something or not.
Okay, so essentially, again, this token has the user ID, some context about like how the session was initiated, and like kind of like a level of like escalation or type of session, elevation of permission, sorry, and also like the roles that the user has. Then you send that around again. You pass that around the different services to validate the token. You check its signature, as you mentioned. If it's valid, then you go check the claims, and you can use that. Now, you also mentioned the notion of the sidecar. You mentioned the wording like policy agent. What is a policy agent? What is a policy language? Like, how are you dealing with that? How did you come on to a decision on that? Can you share a bit about that?
Yeah, sure. So when we started building our solutions to evaluate permissions, we tested different frameworks and different solutions that are open source, and we also thought about implementing our own. And currently, our PolicyAgent is our application, being that it's run as a sidecar or as an external application. And that application is the one that evaluates the policies with the context users to understand if a user has the correct permissions or not. And in those cases, basically the question itself is what's written on a policy, what we call a policy, that are the rules that are going to be evaluated. So if before maybe you wrote an if with the question, if this user has this permission, then allow, else deny. That's same type of question or logic is implemented in a language that's called Rego, and then it's evaluated on a framework which is called the Open Policy Agent, or OPA. And also we decided to extend that framework because we saw that in some cases it wasn't performing as we expected to, and But what is cool about Rego is that you are able to ask pretty complex questions, if you will, because it's a language that allows you to maybe write ifs, write regex, write different type of solutions or questions, or implement loops, for example. So with a single language, if you will, you're able to basically map or write any type of question that you have regarding the authorization. Obviously, it's a complex language. It's not something that anyone can start writing from scratch. You need to read documentation, and it has a learning curve.
And what are the benefits of using something like Rego rather than, I'm making something up, having a sidecar that can load up a bunch of Java files with like abstract class implementations for policy checking, like typical chain of responsibility, and then you just give passing parameters and let anyone write whatever they want?
I think it is more or less the same at the end. You're writing in a specific language and processing and loading everything the policies are loading on your sidecar memory to be evaluated. In the case of Rego and actually on Open PolicyAgent, the framework is pretty good on the optimization side of the policy. So a lot of things are indexed. They have several type of indexes, and that helps make sure that for the most simple questions, they are evaluated in I think microseconds, and in some other cases, obviously they take a little more. But what we are doing right now, or thinking and starting a few POCs, is basically we want to be able to, if we want to move from Rego to other systems. We don't want to have the whole company depend on a specific solutions. No, okay. So in some cases, our developers are able to write Rego policies, but in some other cases, what we are doing is having different public services, if you will, front ends, where our developers are able to write policies in a wizard way, if you will, similar to what Amazon do with their IAM policies, for example. So in first you complete some questions like, are you going to be evaluating user permissions, and what type of permissions do you need to evaluate, and in which context are you going to be asking these questions. And with that information, we then go and create on our backend the correct policies. So if we want to move from Rego to other type of languages, we are able to do so. So it's like creating your own DSL, if you will.
Yes. One of the things we talk about that a lot about Auth0 internally is that when chatting with companies that are using Rego, if they are large enough, they don't allow their developers to write Rego. They end up having that abstraction layer, and like everything else, like in programming, you just add a pointer and you solve problems. In your case, you're solving two problems. You're solving Rego's complexity by kind of like providing the wizard as a platform team, but also you are adding a layer of abstractions to switch that when necessary. How did you come, like, more thinking from a product platform perspective, not necessarily a security perspective, how did you come up with that idea of, hey, we need a wizard? This is something that would be valuable for our product team. Sorry.
I think when we started as a team evaluating options and basically thinking, we thought about two things when we started doing this. The first one was obviously from a security perspective, we need to improve our authorization service and solution and be able to make sure that the whole company is using it. That which ended to the second question. Okay, how we do that? How do we make sure that everyone start using this type of services and solutions? Because we could have ended up saying to everyone, okay, you need to learn Rego and need to implement these type of solutions to your applications, and you have this deadline. But that wasn't realistic in a company that has thousands of employees. You need to create abstractions and you need to create solutions that are easy to use, and asking the whole company to learn about Rego for, in some cases, for the same type of question, it didn't make sense, because you obviously have pretty complex questions around the authorization that you need to make, but there are a bunch of other applications that you only need to ask for specific questions like, does this user have this type of permissions? And the answer should be yes or no. And you might end up asking for or configuring for a specific URL on your application that you need to have those permissions. And if you're going to have thousands of applications and a bunch of use cases are more or less the same, you obviously need to create tools to make sure that those steps, if you will, are not happening, are not repeating all the time. And the way to do so is creating abstractions and creating really simple solutions that any user, any developer can use. I think it's the same for you guys, for AuthZ. It's how we make the authentication and identity validation as simple as possible, and that's what we try to do in our case.
That's a great mindset, and I think having that internal product mindset is sometimes hard for platform teams. So it's great to see how, again, a concrete example of it being kind of put into practice in a very successful way. So good job there.
Thank you.
So whenever I'm running these policies, I have the identity token. How often is data from outside the identity token necessary to make an authorization decision, and where does that data come from?
So for each request that is authenticating, we should be creating a specific identity token. There are obviously things that we are doing to improve the performance, like caching and whatnot. But what we are trying to do is making sure that those tokens that we are creating don't live for a pretty long time. Because if one of those tokens are leaked, maybe someone could be doing actions in the name of a specific user without the correct permissions, and obviously those tokens that are internal don't work outside of our internal systems. But for us is the same. We try to make sure that the security is both from the outside world to our internal solutions and our internal networks, if you will. So those tokens shouldn't live pretty long, and obviously if a specific permission for a user is changing, or someone a permission is revoked, they need to change as soon as possible. Obviously, you have propagation and that sort of issues, but that has to be something that changes as quickly as possible, because if not, you could end up giving more permissions that what the user uh, need to have or was intended to have.
That makes sense. So that's kind of like the context of how often you refresh the token, and how you ensure that one of the things you mentioned earlier, whenever like someone changes roles, that's propagated quickly into newly minted identity tokens for new requests. What about the case, for example, you mentioned earlier, which was, well, it's not only about the user, but about the credit card company that they are using for the payment, where like I guess that might not necessarily be in the identity token, maybe it is.
No, in those cases, so basically, most of our permission solution is based on it's a role based solution. You know? We are extending some cases with some attributes, but it's not solely based on attributes. It's not ABAC, if you will. It's more like RBAC, for example. But so in most of the business case of the APIs could be mapped to an authorization, if you will. You may want to ask questions like, has this user the ability to use this specific credit card, or is the user able to create payments on a Monday, for example, or I don't know, different questions that are more related to the business side. So although our system is pretty generic and can maybe ask those type of questions, we try to move away from that, and make sure that is mostly based on the questions regarding the authorization, regarding the permissions, and some specific cases that may are close to the business side, but not are necessarily business questions, if you will. I don't know if
Okay,
that makes sense.
yeah, that makes sense. It's is there like maybe quick yes no, or is there like how do you find out if a team is using an authorization anti-pattern?
That's a great question, and we don't have right now the correct answer, or the best scenario, because there are cases where that could happen. Um, Basically, because our system has been in production for a few months, and it's not being used for whole Mercado Pago, we are moving forward with getting new teams to use our solutions. We are working pretty close with our new clients, if you will, trying to create solutions and documentation where we make sure that for most of the most common questions, there are a step by step or a wizard to be able to create that. So we make sure that in those cases we try to push people away from writing their own Rego policies, to make sure that those cases, if they need to, they can, but we try to give support for those cases and understand if that's something that they really need to implement on the authorization side, if it's really an authorization question, or if it's something more business related. And in those cases, we try to educate our users. But because of the growth of Mercado Libre, is some of the things that we need continue working on to make sure that we are able to understand more easily the type of questions our users are making.
That makes sense. Yeah, that's a good answer. And we've done similar things at Auth0, like thinking as a platform where first you kind of like ship something, you do like the very non-scalable consulting, right? Like the
Yeah.
do things and don't scale approach. And then over time you add the tooling, you add more capabilities, but that's not how you start, and definitely not the best way to validate something before continuing to invest in
Yeah,
it.
your users are never going to use the product as you intended to. They're always going to find some uh, different type of use or things that you need to be close to make sure that they are going for the right path. But I think that's we take those kind of cases as feedback to improve our solutions, because if a specific team is building policies that are being written in Rego, and they're trying to, I don't know, do a specific use case that is pretty weird. In most cases, I think that's related to maybe bad documentation or something that is not really clear on our service, or something that we need to improve as a as solution for the problem.
Yeah, that makes sense. Feedback is a gift, and it doesn't always come in the hey, have you considered doing this? Usually it doesn't. It's mostly like reading between the lines and trying to figure out
Yeah,
what actually happened in different situations.
yeah.
How do you like the version policies? That's kind of like maybe a security slash compliance question,
Mm-hmm.
and I understand that's kind of like important because of like regulation, but also because like as a company you need to know what changed, especially if you are now aware that it's not just code but also authorization that might be a thing. So that's kind
Yeah,
of like
for
the
sure.
security compliance question. Then the DevOps and the operational infrastructure question: how do you roll out policy changes in a reliable fashion?
Yeah, so um, most of the policy changes are, well, all of the policy changes are obviously audited, and we create new versions for each of the changes and the policies that are being deployed on our company, on our applications, and we make sure that we understand who did what, and which what time they changed something, and to have that information as clear as possible to the owner of the application. And obviously, not everyone can deploy to policies to production. Inside of Mercado Libre, we have a platform as a service called Fury, and obviously Fury has their own permission roles, and they have different type of users inside the company and the applications, and so there are a few type of users that are able to make changes and deploy to production new policies. But we are working also with improving adding an approval uh, path or approval system to make sure that in some cases where, as you mentioned, you have a regulation or something that is really critical on the business side, uh, you are you make sure that you need a specific approval for deploying to production. And
Is that
when
is that
yeah.
in source control? Is that a system that you have kind of like on top of that that manages your CI/CD, Is that a separate compliance-related system that kind of like hooks into your source control? How does that work?
So what we're doing right now is basically a pretty, I think, simple solution, which is most of our policies end up in S3 of Amazon service as a tax policy with all the rules, and there obviously not anyone can go and change something on the files. And those policies are all the sidecars of the applications are checking every minute or so if there are changes on their policies, and they are pulling the information. And if they find that a policy has changed, they basically download the new policy and change it on their on memory side.
I like that. It's fairly simple, and I don't think enough of us use S3 as much as we should. It's a very powerful system for lots of things.
Yeah, and I think on the reliability side, is obviously a hugely used service, and it's really really reliable. I think it's like 5 nines on their SLAs or something like that, and obviously I think we we have a lot of things that could fail before S3, and you obviously have different type of problems that could happen, like being inconsistent when uh, a specific instance is not able to load or download the new policies. But we try to send metrics for every step of the way of reloading and evaluating policies, and obviously monitor that and alert if something is failing after a long time or after a few minutes.
Yeah, that makes sense. That's great. So we're close to wrapping up. Before I ask my last question, I want to share with everyone listening. Next week, we're going to have folks from GitHub. They are going to be talking about how authorization works at GitHub and the whole like enterprise plans and who can read repositories, who can have access to things based on like what team they're on and how everything works internally. So that should be an interesting chat. Juan, what are you like the key things that you learned working on this kind of like authorization capabilities? A lot of these things are relatively new, especially kind of like OPA, Rego are newish, a couple of years old in the Kubernetes environment. What are kind of like your key takeaways?
So first of all, I think authorization and all this security part of our solution and our company are really complex, and when you see something in the scale of Mercado Libre and that need to work on that scale, it's a pretty difficult problem to fix. So I think when we started, we tried to do too many things at once, or try to create first a solution that could work for any type of use case. In some cases, that's not always a good choice. In our case, what we end up doing was creating a pretty generic solution that focuses on managing obviously permissions and asking or being able to ask any question that the user has. In most cases, or in some cases, that type of solution could not be the most performant one, but we always try to be pragmatic with our solutions. They obviously need to work, be resilient, and be low latency. But in some cases, we we prefer to be able to move forward and to start using and testing and doing an iterative solution and basically start testing as soon as possible, trying to create hypotheses and seeing if those are true or not, and not trying to create the perfect system that is going to scale to hundreds of millions of requests from day one, and we try to keep things as simple as possible, and to use mechanisms that we know work correctly, and 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 move forward from that step, and see if we need to make something a bit more complex or not, or keep it as simple as possible always. I think that's some of our key learnings when doing this.
Those are good takeaways. Authorization's hard, and iterate.
Yeah.
Great. So again, thanks a lot, Juan, for your time. I know we talked a couple of times about doing this. It got postponed, so really happy to have you here. Everyone listening, thanks a lot for listening in. We will have the recording of this posted likely either today or tomorrow or Friday. If you missed any part of the conversation, you should be able to kind of like re-listen to it on YouTube. As I said earlier, before, do tune in next week. It's going to be earlier because the people we're going to be talking to are in Europe, but we're going to be chatting with the GitHub folks about authorization as well. Thanks a lot, Juan.
Thanks for having me. Bye-bye.
Bye.